World War I began because Russia was determined to protect Serbia against Austria and Germany. And in the course of this, you get the bombing going on for a couple of months. The bridges over the Danube are destroyed. Militarily, it doesn't work. The Serbian army is intact. And Tony Blair begins agitating for a ground invasion, a land war against Serbia. We have to now start counting. There are 3 times that the World War III question emerges during these years. The first one is when Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, rouses himself to say, if NATO launches the land attack on Serbia, they will get a general European war and most likely World War III, documented. This goes on then, and Clinton, much to his credit, refuses to have the land invasion. So the bombing goes on, and ultimately Russia is able to secure a peaceful solution. Got to remember that somebody like Richard Holbrooke is way up front in the bombing, somebody who Kerry probably would have made Secretary of State. At the end of this war, the Russians say, we want a zone of Serbia for us to occupy. NATO says no. U.S. says, no, you're not going to get it. So the Russians, they have some forces in Bosnia. They get some tanks, and they drive them to the Pristina airport in northern Kosovo province, and they seize the airport. And at this point, General Wesley Clark, Michael Moore's favorite candidate for president, I must add, and many other people in the Democratic Party seem to think that he was a good idea for president. Wesley Clark goes nuts, and he orders Lieutenant General Sir Michael Jackson of the British Army to go and kick the Russians off the airfield. The classic answer is, from Michael Jackson, Sir Michael Jackson, I'm not starting World War III for you. Second mention of World War III. Ultimately, the crisis gets down because the Russians don't have any food. So that's calmed down. In the summer of 2000, August 2000, the most modern nuclear submarine of the Russian Navy, the Kursk, is destroyed in the Barents Sea. It's in August. The Russians come out and say, this was a deliberate destruction of the submarine by a NATO submarine, most likely British. They don't know how it happened, but that's who they accuse of doing it. The Western media concentrates on the alleged ineptitude of the Russians, that they can't save the people, that they don't have a diving bell, and all the rest of this. But Pravda says World War III almost started on Saturday. That's the third mention of World War III in some sort of authoritative or semi-authoritative way during this period. So what do you have? You imagine the invisible government, these war-mongering types, military, CIA, special forces. They see that China is developing at 12% or 15% a year. The Arabs are not dominated necessarily. Some are, some aren't. And Russia is also beginning to rearm in some ways. They're building the Topol missile, the Sunburn missile, other kinds of military technology. What you begin to see is this restless desire for decisive military action percolating up from the invisible government through the neocons who are their spokesmen and participants. And then you get 9/11. So you can see that it starts going. Just a couple of things. The United States did not become hated in the world as a result of the Iraq War. The United States became universally hated as a result of the bombing of Serbia. That Russia went wild, and when the U.S. bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, China also participated in this. So this is the beginning of a lot of that hatred. So the American media never put that picture together. I've tried to do it. So we see that 9/11 is a result of a kind of an escalation. And the superpower tensions connected to 9/11, it seems to me, are closely related to the process that builds up. And that's also what this Namicon source says.
You also examine something called the 9/11 myth, collective schizophrenia. What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the questions involved here is, why do people believe this? What's the basis for the mass acceptance of the myth? In the first chapter, I go into the genesis of the myth. The genesis of the myth is in a few words that Richard Clarke and George Tenet put out the line, it's Al-Qaeda, it's bin Laden. Bush repeated it, and then the rest of the people in the Bush regime. But the problem then is that many Americans don't believe Bush or didn't believe Bush on Iraq, certainly don't now, but they continue to believe him on 9/11. What can explain the tenacity of the myth, given the fact that the myth is absurd and there's a large amount of stuff in the public domain that would tend to show you that the myth is false, that it's hooked up. Part of this then has to do with the negative changes that have occurred in intellectual life in this country and in the kind of mentality of average people. I went and found, for example, Dr. Justin Frank, as far as Bush is concerned, right? He's got Bush on the couch. His conclusion is that Bush is a paranoid schizophrenic. And I think this is important because Bush, even though I try to argue that Bush is not the planner or indeed not really important in the carrying out of 9/11, at least up until he starts making speeches, Bush is the salesman of the 9/11 myth. And what you have to see is Bush as a schizophrenic personality radiating schizophrenia and autism out into the world. Now, perhaps a word on what these definitions mean. Schizophrenia, if you ask the average person, they might say, well, it's a split personality, which is fine as far as it goes, and I'm not a psychiatrist, but I have tried to read up on these things. The notion is, developed by Silvano Arieti, the main authority on schizophrenia, is that it's the dissociation of the mental faculties, so they can't work together. That would be the split, right? The perception and cognition don't work together, feeling goes in another direction, and it's all dissociated. But then there's another dissociation, which is that the schizophrenic personality has a very weak relation to reality. Now that's Bush, weak relation to reality, dream world, ideological construct world, things of this sort. So he's a perfect salesman. But now let's look at the people. There's a French psychoanalyst by the name of Joseph Gabel, who in the mid of the 1970s, more or less, wrote a book on, he calls it reification. Reification or political alienation. And what he does is go to Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, communist Russia, and try to show how regime propaganda depends on what he describes as a schizophrenic world outlook. And he refines that to call it the police concept of history, or the police theory of history. I would call it the CIA theory of history, or maybe the intelligence community theory of history. And what does this involve? It means, first of all, that history is not real. There are no real processes going on in history. So what about things that happen? Things that happen are either miraculous, wonderful events, or they're catastrophes. The world is then, and this is still the propaganda world of the Nazis and the Soviet communists, the world is divided between a privileged system, the U.S., in which everything is by definition perfect. Then there's the non-privileged system, today the Arab and Islamic world, where things are necessarily all bad. And the problem arises then, the critical moment arises when a catastrophe occurs inside the privileged system. And the response to that catastrophe is, since the privileged system is by definition perfect, the only way such a thing could happen is by the evil, aggressive activities of the outside group that you're targeting. And that is pretty much 9/11. Outside, outside, outside. In other words, the causes have to be looked for outside. I was interested to find that Gerhard Wisniewski, in his book on 9/11 in German, wrote that every aspect of the 9/11 myth screams outside, outside, outside. So Gabel wrote this 30 years ago. And what you find is an uncanny resemblance to his study of Soviet and Nazi propaganda as the expression of political alienation and of schizophrenia and autism in mass psychology, and the way that this 9/11 myth has been put together. Certainly the question of fear. It sounds needless to repeat it maybe, but the goal of terrorism is terror.